So obviously I'm probably going to be focusing on the voice of the future and what do those future environments look like. And Andrew here is going to be talking about what does today look like and the voice of the present. So we'll start Andrew off with, how is the customer being designed for today?
Well, Noriko, it's a bit of a journey. When we talk about customer experience, we're talking about the sum of people's interactions with the products, systems, services and spaces that people interact with, and then the way that those things are designed together for people when they have those experiences. So this is really about how we put all of the pieces together and how good we are at actually designing those pieces together. The use of user-centered or human-centered or customer-centered design, you may have heard them called different things, is relatively new in the world of transportation and infrastructure. If you sort of look around, you'll see that that banks or telecommunications companies or fast-moving consumer goods companies are really experienced in understanding deeply the needs of their customers and then designing those things that then meet those needs. And that's a fairly new thing for infrastructure, because generally we sort of, we're told to build something and we get on and build it. And so for us, this world of understanding those people's needs is a relatively new thing. So that's our focus now in terms of the approach that we take when we're looking towards transport infrastructure projects.
So when we were discussing this previously, you mentioned that we focus on a certain group of users when we design for today.
Yeah.
What are those?
Well, traditionally, if we've designed for any customers, it's really been about that single peak hour commuter, the one that we know about and the one that we measure a lot in the way that we look at the design. And so the way that we need to take that forward is very much around actually broadening that out to understand who are all of the people that are using those services at all times of the day.
So who are some of those users that you can mention right now?
Yeah, sure. So this is around really understanding the needs of everybody who's using that. So not only do you have those people who value time, which might be the commuters, but you've also got families with children. You've got a whole bunch of people with a wide range of accessibility needs. You've got people that are experiencing the products that we build on a temporary basis. So to earlier speakers, they might be tourists or other people that are experiencing the service for the first time. So it's really important that we step into their shoes and understand those kinds of needs and how we need to service those today.
That's really interesting. There's a big focus at the moment of how can we increase participation in the economy through getting more women into work. Those wave graphs earlier were quite fascinating of how do we actually service those big projects. And it sounds like getting more people moving in different ways is going to be really important.
Yeah, I think so. So in terms of needs, I think some of the research has been really interesting in drawing out the fact that people's mobility decisions actually start at home. In the way that we've looked at some of our mobility projects, a lot of people assume that those things kind of start when you get to a railway station or something like that. And so for us, actually recognising the fact that people's choices of mobility start at home is really key. And in terms of some of their needs, it's really around serving some of those first and last mile connectivity issues that are really key for people, because that's linked to those mobility decisions around actually how easy is it for me to have a journey. So you wouldn't want to necessarily have a major rail project, for example, compromised by a lack of connectivity to those hubs for people to access those services as well. And often something that's not actually being delivered as part of the scope of a rail project, but is adjacent to that, but has a really high dependency on the way that people interact with those spaces as well. So, Noriko, what do we know about users of the future?
Did that work? Yes. So when we think about the future, we understand that the scope of options expand. There's a lot of uncertainty. There are many different pathways and a lot of divergent pathways, particularly at the moment. Things are expanding. If you look at autonomous vehicles, there's one scenario which has a 93% reduction of fleet. Another scenario has an increasing set of congestion issues. And the question is, which pathway are we taking and how do we take it? So when we look at the future, in Aurecon, we use the 3 horizons model. The question that I often ask is, are we optimizing for the present and the existing users and the existing conditions, or are we in fact thinking about transformation? Are we thinking about the big shifts that need to happen to make these big changes? And earlier today, we heard about how we can't continue on the same pathways. We mentioned earlier that BAU puts us in an interesting position. The Infrastructure Australia report said we're not even at peak congestion yet. So what are the fundamental shifts that we need to think about in order to get these changes and in order to change the transport system? So we're also going to have a bit of audience participation. Can everyone or who their family members has taken an Uber or participated in Airbnb raise their hands? Wow, okay, that's most of the room. Keep them up. Sorry, I forgot that part. Who would have done that 10 years ago? Pretty much no one. So one of the things that we look about in the future space is the interaction between users and technology. We talk about that feedback loop, about how we shape our technology, but then our technology also shapes us. 10 years ago, before Facebook was a large thing and changed how digital interactions and the social contract operated, we would not have got into a car with a stranger. We would have not gone and stayed in a stranger's house we'd never met before. Yet even in the past 10 years, user needs have shifted significantly, thanks to how social contracts are changing and thanks to how other things are changing. But the interesting thing is those technologies themselves have had increased impacts on the system. And so the other thing that we look at in my space are what are the impacts and implications of emerging tech? And what are they actually doing to shift the system itself? And one of the big things about future roads and transport is electric vehicles. And a big question I ask is, are we actually shifting the system, or are we simply substituting one form of engine for another? And if we do that, do we then prolong private vehicle use? Particularly when you consider that there is the potential of electric vehicles to be part of your home energy system and part of evening out the electricity demand issues. Then what does that then mean if we could move to an autonomous system? What does that then mean for us if we would want to move to autonomous vehicles which have other associated technology benefits and efficiency benefits for the roads? So the questions that we ask in my field is, what are the user needs changing, and how, in making decisions today, are we in fact embedding BAU? Are we embedding the position that we're in? And are we preventing transitions and shifts to a different type of future?
So what are those trends and emerging technologies, Naraka?
So the really interesting one, which was touched on earlier, was mobility as a service. And we're seeing a shift away from personal ownership and to collective forms of transport. Mobility as a service is a transition that we're seeing across lots of other industries as well. But I think the interesting thing here is, what are the shifts that we have to make that happen? And I should probably change this slide. Some of the emerging technologies, how far or close or far away they are. And I've put mobility as a service further down as further away because that's looking at it as a mature thing. But there are things that are happening now that we can do and look at. How do we get modal shifts between road, rail, and trams? How do we push people to do more car share? Micro-mobility has been a thing that's come out of nowhere in the last 2 to 3 years that are changing how people get around cities. So the question is, how do we manage these shifts, and how do we make decisions that actually transition? And part of that was touched on earlier. What are some of the choices we make as a group? What are some of the choices we make collectively? And one of the things that we found through the survey and this report that Aurecon put out was the focus we put on convenience. And who are we making things convenient for? And do we need to start rethinking what convenience means? Do we need to start thinking about convenience at collectives and for groups as opposed to individuals?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point in that, I mean, like any consumer product, you're more likely to use something if it makes your life easier. Who here has used something that makes their life harder? Exactly. So seeing that convenience is a trend coming through and that people still want that in the future is very much a human trait. So are you going to make my life easier? And so some of the things that we're seeing, for example, in some of this technology is good. Some of the other aspects that the moving people and goods research called out was around environment and cost as well. And so people are saying actually make it easy for me, but do it in a sustainable way at a price that I can afford. And so looking at things like autonomous vehicles, it will provide great social aspects to those collectives and saying, actually, what job can we do when the cost comes down so that the technology is ready, it's doing it in an environmentally sustainable way. But the other thing too is that we need to make sure that everybody can participate in this. How are we making sure that the technology solutions are not just geared for those who are the privileged few?
And that's a really interesting question, because if you look at how a lot of these technologies are rolling out, they are privileging certain groups of society. And in any case, technology tends to run ahead of what society can manage. Regulation constantly struggles to keep up with how technology is evolving. And we're seeing a lot of the unintended consequences right now of technology just surging forwards. Some of the things that we're seeing around how data is used and data is shared, and cybersecurity is a function of that. And those things are going to become increasingly important going forward into the transport space, as some of the future mobility options are incredibly data dependent and connectivity dependent. And what does that mean for security and safety? It's fascinating how a single drone shut down Gatwick, a major airport in London. How do we then manage these runaway consequences? And there's a question that I find fascinating around autonomous vehicles, is that while the technology is getting there and it's going to evolve, currently the solutions for fast-track deployment is to put pedestrians in cages and wall them off from the traffic, because the technology can't currently interact with unpredictability of pedestrians, of cyclists, of human drivers. And in Australia, we have a really fun set of problems with kangaroos. There was a really high-profile example in Adelaide a couple of years ago, I think, where the autonomous vehicle couldn't identify the kangaroo. And so technology is being created in place, but in different places to the Australian context. And what does that look like here? And what is the social acceptance of these technologies is another really interesting point.
Yeah, I think it's a really key point to consider. In the report, it was really interesting that people were ready for autonomous vehicles. They're like, yes, actually, this is what I want to solve all my problems. But the industry and the technology wasn't there yet. So it's about mashing the two together and in finding that sweet spot when the use of this technology can play a much broader role in the way that we look at making our cities far more livable as well. So,
and there are some big visions about the future of cities and the future of transport. And they include things like urban air mobility. So instead of getting in a taxi, you can get into a flying taxi and go vertical takeoff and landing drones from point to point, or drone delivery. But it's the transition which becomes interesting, and the choices we make when we transition. And how do we start making those choices and fully informed choices? And noting the mental health discussion that was previously, these are some of the feedback loops that we're facing in this Industry 4.0 environment, in the future of transport environment. We've got increasing complexity, so the technologies themselves are becoming increasingly complex, but the systems and the people and the economies and the societies they operate are as well. We're seeing accelerating change. And even those two things alone are scary for people. That uncertainty and that change creates fear. So how are we having those conversations with people in the face of these things? And how important is to put people back into the centre of these technology conversations?
I think it's a fundamental thing that we need to really put people at the centre of the design of what we do. We need to make sure that the design of our built forms are adequately supporting the kinds of things that we're talking about in future as well. So if we're talking about urban air mobility, actually how are we considering the timeframes for the arrival of this kind of technology, and then designing our built form so that it's suitable and compatible with those type of movements that people want, and that we design our cities so that they're ready and able to deal with those kind of technologies as we do them. We face a challenge that a lot of our infrastructure projects won't be, that we're planning today won't be realised for 8 to 10 years, and in case of suburban rail loop, even longer for some sections. So how are we taking those kind of conversations into the design and planning phases of these projects to make sure that they're fit for purpose for people for the future?